Hello, everybody, and welcome back to English 2367. This is K-Swizzle checking in with your week 6 overview lecture. I hope that you are doing okay, that you are having a good week or weekend, or just frankly a good day, whatever point that you are watching this lecture. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and take us into what it is that you need to be thinking about for week 6, especially because we are in what's pretty much the final stretch of our course for the rest of the semester, because we are in week 6 of 8 total weeks. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that you need to be thinking about. And of course, I encourage you to ignore my cats, who are, of course, as always, doing things in the background whenever I try to record a lecture. All right, so there we go. So like I said, this is my week 6 overview lecture for you. And I want to talk through what is on the agenda. So we've got 3 sections. We're going to talk about this week's theme, this week's to-do list, and the assignment snapshots. So in terms of this week's theme, we'll be thinking about researching for the final project or finding and integrating secondary sources into your writing. And we're going to talk specifically about the literature review and how this acts as the second step of the semester research project. We're going to follow this then with this week's to-do list, which is pretty brief in nature, but it's going to consist of what to read and just some things to keep in mind to look ahead to week 7 and 8 and be prepped for. And finally, we will do the assignment snapshots, or an overview of week 6 assignments, which consists of the final draft of the research proposal and the rough draft of the literature review. So let's talk about this week's theme. Like I said, it's researching for the final project, finding and integrating secondary sources into your writing. Now, the reason that I've chosen this theme for this week is because, if you'll recall, your semester research project really takes up the kind of second half of the semester, or the part 2 of the semester in terms of the assignments. But also this is the point when you're really thinking about how do you take what it is that we've covered in the social media studies overview that consisted of weeks 1 to 4, and how do we translate that into a feasible, interesting final project for you to work on, that in using multiple weeks to do so, you really have the opportunity to refine different types of skills that you'll need to perform confidently and comfortably on that final project. So for me, the priority then needs to be that we really think about, what does it mean to find secondary sources that supplement the argumentative claims that you proceed to make in the course of your final project, but also really thinking about how do you actually go about the process of integrating those secondary sources into your writing. Now, you may have noticed on my feedback for your response paper 1 that I will have flagged in some cases if you were using language that was too identical to the language that was originally used by the author, right? Especially if you did so without using quotation marks or some kind of proper attribution. And so you'll find in this week's focus lecture, I'm going to really spend a lot of time talking about how do we avoid the sort of woes of accidental plagiarism that are bound to happen in an assignment like a final project or a response paper, where you're distilling someone else's words and kind of connecting them in some way to your own research. And in particular, I want us to really pay attention to this week with the literature review assignment. What does it mean to actually be able to, definitively point to where the thesis or the project or the methodology of a given creator is in the course of engaging with their writing for the popular press or an academic publisher, okay? And we'll talk more about that in substantial detail in that focus lecture. But for now, I just want you to know that that's really the direction that we're moving in for this week. And the reason is because if you look ahead at the prompt for the final project, you are expected to include secondary sources in your final to really supplement the argument that you're making about a primary source. So the way that we're going to get here then is with the literature review. And there's a kind of rough timeline that I provide here that can kind of help supplement thinking about what are the steps you need to take to get this literature review done. Okay, so you'll submit a rough draft of your literature review by Saturday, June 18th, ideally, though because it is a Saturday assignment, you can turn it in up until Monday, June 20th. Now, the difference between the literature review rough draft compared to the rough draft of the research proposal is that instead of your peers providing you with feedback, I will be the sole provider of feedback in this case. Reason being, the literature review is a much more robust assignment. It's a lot longer. And I generally find that the feedback you get from me on this particular assignment is going to be the most useful in terms of advancing kind of that research proposal from a sketch to a working idea to like the idea that you're actually working on. And so to really help you think about how you can finalize and enhance what your ideas are for that final project, I find it best to really devote the majority of my feedback to this literature review step. Now, this does not mean that I'm not going to provide you with feedback on the research proposal. I definitely will, but you'll just find that the feedback that I give you on the literature review is going to definitely be forward focused, in the sense that I'm going to often make comments saying, when you revise this for the final, or if you use this particular source in your final, think about X, Y, and Z. And the goal here is that you really get sort of the most in-depth feedback from me on this assignment to help you move from a rough draft to a final draft, okay? And then my goal is to provide you with the feedback on this literature review rough draft by Tuesday, June 21st. Time-wise, I'm not super specific, but the reason I say Tuesday is because depending on when you turn in this rough draft, right? If you turn it in on Saturday, there's a better chance you're going to get feedback from me a bit sooner. If you turn in your rough draft on Monday, then that means it's definitely going to be coming to you on that Tuesday, right? So if it's of priority to you to get feedback from me sooner rather than later, consider if it's possible for you to turn in that draft sooner rather than later, because that's going to really mirror the timeline as to when I can actually have a chance to read your draft and provide you with that feedback. The final draft of this lit review will be due on Wednesday, June 22nd, but I will accept it up until Friday, June 24th. And so the idea here is that, you can definitely make use of this extended submission timeline however feels most comfortable for you. Just keep in mind that my feedback is going to really depend on, kind of when I get it is going to be when you get that feedback, if that makes sense. There's a relationship between the two. I know I'm definitely behind on feedback for the assignments before this. However, when it comes to your final project, it is important to me that I'm really responding in as close to real time as I possibly can, especially since I don't get to see your beautiful faces face to face. But, in thinking about this semester research project, we of course can recall that this lit review counts for 15% of the kind of overall percentage that that semester research project counts for. And I just want to flag that it is 5 to 6 pages in length, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the prompt in a little bit. Just checking to make sure my cat's not doing something behind me. All right, so in terms of this week's to-do list or tasks to complete before watching the next lecture, it is pretty brief. I wanted to once again kind of emphasize that for this particular week, you are not expected to provide feedback to your peers. You already did that last week with the research proposal, which of course, as you know, the timeline on that changed a little bit based on my timeline changing because of getting super sick with COVID. So I feel like I mentioned already that it makes the most sense for me to be the primary provider of feedback for the lit review. So know that you don't need to worry about reviewing your peers' drafts in any capacity for this particular week. Instead, what I ask you to do is really make sure that you complete this week's reading, which is from Who Says, and it's chapter 6, pages 76 to 95. Now, I reminded you in my previous overview lecture from last week that it would be important for you to get access to a copy of Who Says. I want to re-emphasize this and also re-emphasize that you need to be doing the reading for this class leading up to the final weeks of the semester. I know it can be tempting to not do the reading, but it's going to be especially important because since this is an accelerated course and we don't get to see each other in person, there's a limitation or constraint on how much time I really get to devote on writing strategies, as opposed to, if I'm seeing you in office hours and we can talk about those things in a more extended capacity. So please, please, please make sure that you're reading the chapter from Who Says, because what is covered in that chapter is really kind of a supplement to what I focus on in my focus lecture, okay? I intentionally have selected this book to be that companion so that you can ideally have that further explication on what it is that I'm talking about in my lectures, especially if you don't have the time to watch the lecture in the full capacity that, I ideally would like you to do, right? I know that you live a full life outside of this class, and I encourage you to live that life, but definitely at the very least skim this chapter and have that as a companion to the focus lecture for me. In terms of thinking ahead to weeks 7 and 8, which are next week and the following week in this course, I want to do this briefly just because, as I mentioned, we're in week 6 of 8 weeks in the semester, which means our class is basically pretty close to being over, right? And so I just wanted to kind of put a few things on your radar now, especially in the event that you anticipate that you're going to have a scheduling conflict here. If you anticipate that you're going to want additional support from me, I want to really flag those things for you now so that you can prep best that you can. So just as a reminder, I do hold office hours every week virtually via Zoom, and I have them on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 o'clock a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm also happy to meet by appointment. So if these times and days don't work with your schedule, but you would like to meet with me, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm more than happy to work with you to find an alternate time frame that we can meet and just talk through things related to the class, talk about submission timelines, whatever it might be. There are no dumb questions, and I want to be here to support you. However, in terms of what's on the books that you can, fully expect from me for the final 2 weeks of this class, and sorry if you can hear my cat making noise in the background, I will have office hours on Tuesday, June 21st, Thursday, June 23rd, Tuesday, June 28th, and Thursday, June 30th. And again, it'll be from 11 o'clock a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And the access information for these office hours are posted under the course materials module on Carmen. Please make use of these office hours. I'm so happy to look at drafts, to talk through prompts, whatever support that you need, I'm so happy to do. Alternatively, if you'd like to check in via email about drafts or questions, that's also totally fine. But I do encourage you to meet with me in office hours if you find that it would be helpful for us to talk through a draft, especially for one of these larger assignments that you might be a bit more nervous about, okay? Now, in terms of remaining deadlines for these last 2 weeks of the semester, you have a few to keep on your radar. You'll need to submit a final draft of your literature review, which I'll talk more about when I talk about the prompt here in a few minutes. But I want to note that the final draft of the literature review, again, is due on Wednesday, June 22nd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern, but I will accept the final draft up until Friday, June 24th at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern, okay? I'm happy to accept it up until Friday if that works best with your schedule. Now, beyond this assignment, you do have some hard deadlines to meet, which means that you do not have the opportunity to turn them in later than the date listed on the schedule, and this is for a few reasons, okay? So you'll notice that you'll need to submit the rough draft of the semester research project by Saturday, June 25th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. You'll need to provide peer feedback on the semester research project by Wednesday, June 29th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And you'll need to submit the final draft of your semester research project by Saturday, July 2nd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And in each case, it says this is a hard deadline with no extended submission, okay? Reason being, with your rough draft of your semester research project, this rough draft will be reviewed by the peers in your semester survival group. And if they don't have ample time to review them and respond to them, it's not going to be possible for them to provide that peer feedback that you are expecting from them and that I'm expecting for them to provide to you by that Wednesday, June 29th time period. You might be thinking, why does this matter? Like, why do we need these rough drafts, et cetera, et cetera? Well, if you notice, the final draft is due on Saturday, July 2nd. And I've given you the latest possible time that you can turn this in because I have to turn grades in the next day. So it's going to be incredibly important that you have peer feedback for your peers in your semester survival group by that Wednesday, because the feedback that you provide by that Wednesday ideally will then be consulted by your group members so that they can utilize it and incorporate it into their project before they turn in the final on that Saturday. Now, I hope that you notice that I do have office hours in between when you provide that peer feedback and when you turn in the final draft of this research project. But I do want to flag that generally speaking, and I've been teaching long enough that I can see this pattern, generally speaking, my office hours that are the last ones that I hold before the final is due tend to be the most popular, right? Because everyone's panicked about their final, they've got a lot of things to think about, they're worried about whatever it might be, maybe they're not sure how to incorporate some feedback. So I do really encourage you to make use of those Tuesday, June 28th office hours if you can, or to schedule a meeting with me the previous week in week 7 to get some of those questions answered so that you're not operating in a more urgent mode by the following week, okay? And I encourage this because, like I said, I tend to see an uptick in, requests for feedback being provided in that final stretch before the final. And I don't provide feedback on the day that the final is due, okay? So I wanna make sure that you have these things on your radar before going into week 7 and 8. All right. So finally, let's talk about the assignment snapshots or the overview of week 6 assignments. So one of the things that you'll need to turn in is the final draft of your research proposal. And this is the final step of part 1 of the semester research project. If you'll recall, the 3 steps consist of the research proposal, the literature review, and the final project. So we know from week 6 week 6? No, I'm sorry, week 5. What am I saying? We know from week 5 that you submitted a rough draft of the research proposal for your peers to respond to and provide that peer feedback on, right? So you'll want to move from having that rough draft that your peers reviewed to actually having this final draft that you turn in via Carmen. So if you'll remember from the prompt, the rough draft was posted to your group's semester survival group folder, and the final draft is posted to Carmen. Now, I do also want to clarify, because I don't know that I made this super clear the first go round. The research proposal accounts for 5% of your final grade, but that 5% is the combination of the rough draft and the final draft together. They're not separately worth 5%. So rather it being a 10% of your final grade, it's 5% total, okay? Reason being that you can't really get the peer feedback done if there's not a rough draft for your peers to review, right? But also in thinking about this research proposal, it made the most sense for me to make sure that, you know, your rough draft and your final draft are a kind of combined total, as opposed to having to worry about separate like point values. Sorry that my cat is being loud in the background. But that 5% again is the combination of the rough draft and the final draft together. So if for whatever reason, let's say you're missing a rough draft of the research proposal, the rough draft being missing is going to kind of deduct from that 5%, not from a separate point value. Does that make sense? If you have any questions on this, please don't hesitate to reach out. I am gonna pause really quick to take that toy away from my cat, and then I will be right back. Okay, and back. So in terms of thinking about the research proposal, right, it had 3 stages. The rough draft of research proposal, which should be complete by the time you watch this lecture. The peer feedback on research proposals, which also should be complete by the time you watch this lecture. And what you have remaining is the final draft of research proposal, which is due on Wednesday of this week, but I will accept it up until Friday. Now, in thinking about moving from the rough draft to the final draft of your research proposal, I wanted to just briefly offer the following. I definitely want you to consult the feedback that you receive from me that you'll get within the next day or so before you turn in this final draft. I also would like you to consult the feedback that your semester survival group members left on the document. And I want you to consult this feedback in the process or in the course of revising and refining the rough draft into a final. Reason being, you don't want the final draft to just be identical to the rough draft, right? The point or purpose, I should say, of getting this feedback from me and your peers is that you've been given the opportunity to think about how can you strengthen this research proposal so that it can be in the best possible shape to help you moving into the final and the lit review, but also so that you can receive the highest possible score on your research proposal by the time that it's turned in, right? So definitely pay attention to the feedback that you're getting from me and your peers, and especially if you're seeing any trends where maybe multiple people are expressing similar questions or asking for clarification on things or affirming that certain choices you've made thus far work really well, really pay attention to those trends because that's going to help you get a sense for what is landing in terms of your reader who's engaging with your work at this stage. So let's talk about the literature review. And again, the literature review is 15% of your final grade, and this counts as part 2 of the semester research project. I almost said process, but project. Okay, so in terms of your lit review, like I said, the rough draft deadline is Saturday, June 18th, but I will accept it up until Monday, June 20th. And the final draft deadline is Wednesday, June 22nd, but I will accept it up until Friday, June 24th. And this is really the last assignment that has that extended submission timeline baked into the process. So as usual, the snapshot from the syllabus is the same information that you saw before when I talked about this assignment initially, but really the lit review is going to be a survey of 4 to 6 secondary sources that relate to your research project topic, okay? And the point of a lit review is that it should summarize, evaluate, and critique each source's argument and methodology. And so you'll find in this week's focus lecture, I'm going to devote a lot of time and attention to talking about how do we differentiate between what the argument and the methodology are, and how exactly can we identify these parts of an argument in an academic article as opposed to in a popular press article, okay? And then I'll kind of talk about the remaining information in the snapshot throughout the rest of this prompt. So there is some pre-work or kind of some initial things you need to cover before you can actually write the literature review. And what that is that you're going to need to locate 4 to 6 secondary sources that are timely, useful, credible, and relevant to the argument that you're making about your research topic and primary source or sources. Now, you'll find that in my feedback on your research proposal, I'm also going to give some, insight or kind of input as to, do you have a working argument right now? Do you have a thesis statement that's, something that could be argued or is debatable? Do you have a clear primary source that you're working off of to help you make this argument, right? Do you have the pieces that you need to really go from kind of an initial idea to begin thinking about how you're, combining ingredients and mixing them together, like we talked about in the discussion, the introductory section last week. Now, in trying to find these 4 to 6 secondary sources, it is required that at least 2 of the secondary sources included in this literature review are scholarly peer-reviewed sources. Now, this can take a number of forms, right? It could be an article published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, a chapter in an edited collection, a chapter in a scholarly monograph. And a monograph is going to be a single author or multi-author study of a topic, such as why comics from underground to everywhere, or #activism, networks of race and gender justice. This doesn't mean you need to use those sources. These are just some examples of, monographs that we've engaged with already this semester. A secondary source that is scholarly peer-reviewed could also be an article or entry published in peer-reviewed, oh my God, just startled me, peer-reviewed online encyclopedias, such as Oxford Research Encyclopedia, right, which is where John K-Swizzle's work comes from. The remaining sources can be any of the following popular press publications. Maybe it's an article from a news site, an interview with the creator of the text that's uploaded to YouTube or is available as a podcast. Perhaps it's an article in a print or online magazine. Maybe it's going to be talking about the relevant socio-political context that you need for that context section in your introductory section. Perhaps it's a documentary related to the topic in some way, or maybe it's an entry on a museum website, right? All of which is to say you need 4 to 6 secondary sources total, but you need at least 2 of them to be scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and the remaining 2 to 4 sources can be any of the following, popular press publications. What this means is that some students ultimately decide to do, 4 scholarly peer-reviewed sources. Perhaps they find a bunch of them in the course of doing their research. Some students do exactly what the prompt says and have those 2 scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and the rest are from the popular press. But just keep in mind that when it comes to what it is that you need to provide, right? You need a minimum of 4 sources and a maximum of 6 sources. You're not beholden to these sources in the course of your final project. And we'll talk about this more in my focus lecture. But really what you're doing here is identifying what are some possible secondary sources that I might consult or I might utilize or might cite in some way in writing or producing my final project, okay? And so you can really think about this then as the literature review is the process of sort of doing that secondary source research up front and also starting to evaluate, could this be something that is ultimately useful for me? And so in the past, I've sometimes had students who do stick with all of the sources that they locate for the literature review when they get to the final project. Alternatively, I've also had students who ultimately only keep a couple of them and find that in the course of writing the lit review, they end up noticing that the source they initially thought might be beneficial for their project isn't going to be such a good fit after all. And that's not a loss. It's just meaning that you're identifying, reevaluating before producing the final project, could this source be something that works well with my project? Now, in terms of writing structure, and I do also want to note that you're welcome to use any of the secondary sources that we have covered in this class as a source in your literature review. You are not required to only use ones that we have not used up until this point. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pause. All right, sorry, y'all, active cat. Okay, where was I? Yes, you are welcome to use any of the secondary sources that we've used in this class as one of your entries for this literature review. If you have questions about which one might fit really well, let me know. I'm happy to talk about it further with you, or if you just find that you're having a hard time locating secondary sources at all, let me know. I'm happy to help you through this process, okay? But in terms of writing structure, okay? I want to cover a few things. So once you have located your secondary sources, right? So once you know what it is that you're going to focus on in this lit review, the task at hand is to produce a 5 to 6 page double-spaced essay in which you synthesize the argument/content of each of your secondary sources and anticipate how these sources will contribute to your respective argument in the final project. So what is similar between a literature review in this capacity and a research proposal is that you're once again speculating or sketching out how you tentatively are thinking about using this source in the course of your project, right? So once again, you're not beholden to this. This is something that you might use in some way in your final project. And so you're talking through with this lit review, how might I use this? How does it relate to my topic? And what could I do with it that would help strengthen my argument in the final, okay? And so this is where the response papers that you've already done kind of come into play, right? So with the response papers in the prompt, I very much set out for you, here's the key concepts, here are some of the kind of key claims that you should be paying attention to, and I want you to talk through where those show up in the article, right? With the literature review, you'll be doing this independently in the sense you'll be independently selecting your secondary sources. And then your task is to once again synthesize that argument and content from the source, but you're going to pair that with an anticipation or a kind of tentative idea about how you would use the secondary source in the final, okay? So it's kind of, the idea here is it's almost like you're doing the response paper combined with the research proposal in that you're synthesizing the secondary source and then you're proceeding to discuss how you might use this in your final, okay? So this essay should offer both an introductory section that contextualizes how these sources are relevant to the student's research questions, right? So how is this connected at all to the topic that you're discussing, as well as a concluding section that establishes how these sources will assist the student in contributing their own intervention to the larger discourse on their research topic, right? So whereas in thinking about the response papers, it was more so about, focusing on really engaging with those ideas and being less concerned with structure. We do want to be attentive to writing structure when it comes to the literature review, because here you're going to be doing a more traditional essay in a sense. And I'll show you some examples of this when it comes to my focus lecture, but you can think about it as you're definitely going to have an introductory section, a concluding section, and a close reading section in between those two bookends, okay? And so whereas last week in my focus lecture, I really covered what goes into an introductory section, for this lecture this week, I'm going to be talking about how do we write a close reading section and how can you write a kind of nice and succinct concluding section before worrying about a more formal developed one for the final project, okay? And so what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to research your topic using databases such as Academic Search Complete, LexisNexis, the OSU Library website, and Google Scholar to locate your sources. You'll need to produce an introductory section to the lit review that makes clear how the research you've conducted will inform your argument and close readings in the final project. You'll need to build on the skills that you practiced in the response papers to synthesize each secondary source in the body of your essay or the close reading section of your essay. And you'll need to produce a concluding section that explicates on how you anticipate you'll use these secondary sources in your final project, right? So kind of key takeaways, central ideas about how you see these secondary sources being of use to you. And each secondary source synthesis should follow what I call the DISCA method, which is describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate. And I'll cover what this DISCA method is in the course of my focus lecture. But really, I like to kind of use this approach in all the classes that I teach, because I think thinking about or breaking down an annotation into the process of being about describing, summarizing, connecting, and anticipating your secondary sources is a more feasible way to understand what goes into writing a literature review or an annotated bibliography, depending on the environment. And so formatting requirements are as follows. You will need 5 to 6 pages double-spaced. 5 full pages is minimum length and 6 full pages is maximum length. You should not go over 6 pages. If you produce a 5-page essay rather than a 5.5 or 6-page essay, the essay should fill the entire 5th page. Otherwise, it is below the page minimum requirement. You should be following MLA format with a proper header, spacing, and page numbers. I do go into detail about what these are in an earlier lecture, so I encourage you to revisit that MLA formatting section of my lectures if you need a refresher, because you do lose points if you do not follow that approach, since I have covered it already. You will need a works cited page and properly formatted in-text citations. These are required elements of the literature review, and I will be covering citation methods in MLA format in the course of my focus lecture. So be prepared, the focus lecture is pretty lengthy this week. The title for your lit review should be unique to the project and should synthesize the proposed research topic / argument, meaning you should start thinking about, if you haven't done so already with the research proposal, what is the title of your project and how does that title help us to get a sense for what it is that you're arguing and about what. And finally, file types that I accept are Word documents, PDF, and Google documents. If you are submitting a Google Doc, you need to make sure that those sharing permissions are enabled so that it can be edited by me. And if it's not readable or accessible to me by the deadline, that is potentially going to lose you some points, okay? So please make sure that your document is set up to be able to have edits by me, because if you submit a Google Doc, I provide my feedback on that Google Doc as opposed to providing it on Carmen, okay? So it's gonna be really important that I have that editing access to be able to actually do that and get you the feedback for your literature review, okay? So with that being said, that is everything that I have for you today in English 2367 and my overview lecture. I appreciate your patience with my cat, who had a lot of energy today. We've mostly gotten her sleeping in the background up until now. I guess my luck has run out, but thank you as always. If you made it all the way through this lecture, I will provide a copy of the Google Slides that I used for this presentation in the description box of this video so that you are able to access them and have them for use either during or after the course of watching this lecture. If any questions come up, you have any concerns, you have any worries, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. As always, I am more than happy to talk to you about things related to this class, whether they are big things, small things, or things that you're just not sure what to do with. And I just want to emphasize again, I am so happy to have you in class this summer. I apologize again for the delay in my feedback because of getting COVID and just not being in good health during the first part of the semester, but I want you to know how much I appreciate you, how much I appreciate the great work that you've turned in thus far, and how excited I am about the great work that I know you'll continue to turn in these final weeks of the semester. All right, everybody, have a lovely day, and I will see you or talk to you again in my focus lecture. All right, bye-bye.